When wealthy rancher Marcus Blackwood quietly followed his maid after her evening chores, he expected to catch her in some minor transgression. Instead, he discovered her kneeling beside her fevered daughter in a crumbling lime shack, whispering desperate prayers that would shatter everything he thought he knew about wealth and worth. But what he found buried in the dust of that forgotten corner of his vast Montana empire would force him to choose between the fortune he'd spent a lifetime building and the family he never knew he needed. So which would prove more valuable than gold? Blood dripped from Marcus Blackwood's knuckles as he wrapped the reins around his saddle horn, the Montana morning air sharp enough to cut glass. His stallion snorted steam into the freezing dawn, hooves dancing on frost-covered ground that crunched like broken bones beneath their weight. Something was wrong at the ranch, dead wrong, and Marcus could smell trouble the way a wolf smells fear. The year was 1882, and winter had come early to the Montana territory, painting the Blackwood Ranch in shades of silver and shadow. Marcus had built this empire from nothing, 10,000 acres of prime grazing land that stretched from the valley floor to the snow-capped peaks beyond. Cattle dotted the landscape like dark stones scattered across a white blanket, their breath creating small clouds in the bitter air. But today felt different. Today felt dangerous. Marcus urged his horse forward, scanning the ranch buildings spread out below him like a miniature town. The main house stood proud and tall, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney where his ranch hands would be stirring coffee and planning their day. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. Then he saw her. A small figure in a dark coat moved between the buildings, carrying something heavy. She walked with purpose, her back straight despite whatever burden she carried. Marcus squinted through the morning mist, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. None of his regular workers moved like that, with such quiet determination. The woman disappeared behind the stable, and Marcus felt his curiosity spike like a fever. New workers came and went on the ranch, but something about this one nagged at him. Maybe it was the way she held herself, proud despite her simple clothes. Maybe it was how she seemed to glide rather than walk, like she was trying not to be noticed. Marcus guided his horse down the slope, staying in the shadows of the pine trees that bordered his property. The cold bit at his face, but he barely felt it. His attention was locked on the spot where the woman had vanished. As he drew closer to the ranch buildings, the familiar sounds of morning reached his ears. Cattle lowing in the distance, the crack of splitting wood as someone prepared kindling, the metallic clang of milk pails being moved around. These were the sounds of his success, the daily symphony of wealth being created. But underneath it all, he heard something else. Voices. Low, urgent voices coming from behind the stable. Marcus dismounted and crept closer, his boots silent on the hard-packed earth. The voices grew clearer as he approached, and he recognized one of them immediately. Jake Sullivan, his foreman, was talking to someone in hushed tones. "Told you to be more careful," Jake was saying, his voice tight with worry. "I am being careful," came a woman's reply. The accent was soft, musical. Spanish, maybe, or Mexican. "But she's getting worse, and I don't know what else to do. If Blackwood finds out, he won't. I make sure of that." Marcus pressed himself against the stable wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. What wouldn't he find out? What was Jake hiding from him? "The medicine costs money," the woman continued. "More money than I have. I can't keep giving you advances on your pay. People will notice." "Advances?" Marcus frowned. Jake had never mentioned giving advances to any of the workers. That wasn't how they ran things at the Blackwood Ranch. Everyone got paid fair and square at the end of each month, no exceptions. "Please," the woman's voice cracked slightly. "She's all I have left. A child." The woman was talking about a child who needed medicine. Marcus felt something twist in his chest, a feeling he didn't quite recognize. Pity? Concern? He'd always prided himself on taking care of his workers, making sure they had decent food and shelter. But apparently someone was falling through the cracks. The conversation continued, but Marcus had heard enough. He backed away from the stable, his mind racing. Jake was giving unauthorized advances to workers, and there was a sick child somewhere on his property that he didn't know about. Neither of these things sat well with him. As he led his horse back toward the main house, Marcus caught another glimpse of the woman. She was walking toward the servants' quarters now, her head down, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. In the growing daylight, he could see her more clearly. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair pulled back under a simple cap. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind that had been mended many times. There was something about her that made Marcus pause. Maybe it was the way she moved, graceful despite her obvious weariness. Maybe it was the dignity in her posture, even when she thought no one was watching. Or maybe it was simply that he'd never seen her before, and Marcus made it his business to know everyone who worked for him. Questions buzzed in his head like angry bees. Who was she? How long had she been working here? Why didn't he know about her sick child? And what exactly was Jake Sullivan's role in all of this? One thing was certain, Marcus Blackwood was going to get some answers, and he was going to get them today. The kitchen erupted in chaos as a pot of coffee crashed to the floor, sending brown liquid splashing across the wooden boards like spilled blood. Marcus stood in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the space as steam rose from the mess at his feet. Every person in the room froze, their faces turning toward him with expressions ranging from surprise to outright fear. "Nobody move," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown men step aside. His eyes swept the room, taking in every detail. The cook, Mrs. Patterson, stood by the stove with her wooden spoon raised like a weapon. Two kitchen maids huddled near the pantry, their aprons stained with flour. And there, kneeling on the floor trying to clean up the spilled coffee, was the woman from behind the stable. "You," Marcus said, pointing directly at her. "Stand up." The woman rose slowly, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching. Up close, Marcus could see that she was even younger than he'd first thought, probably no more than 25. Her face was oval-shaped with high cheekbones and full lips that were pressed together in a thin line. Pretty, he realized with a start that surprised him. "What's your name?" he asked. "Catalina Morales, senor." Her voice was steady, but Marcus caught the slight tremor underneath. "How long have you been working here, Miss Morales?" 3 weeks, senor." 3 weeks. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. 3 weeks, and he'd never seen her before this morning. That meant someone had hired her without his knowledge, something that wasn't supposed to happen at the Blackwood Ranch. "Who hired you?" Catalina's eyes flicked toward Mrs. Patterson, then back to Marcus. "Senor Sullivan said you needed extra help in the house." Jake again. Marcus filed this information away with everything else he'd learned about his foreman this morning. It seemed Jake Sullivan had been making a lot of decisions lately without consulting the man who paid his wages. "And where exactly are you living, Miss Morales?" This time, the tremor in her voice was more noticeable. "Senor Sullivan showed me to the old line shack near the creek. He said it was available." The line shack. Marcus knew the building she meant. A small, drafty cabin that hadn't been used in years. It was barely fit for storing equipment, let alone housing a human being. The idea that someone was living there, especially someone with a sick child, made his stomach churn. "That shack doesn't have proper heating," Marcus said, his voice growing colder. "Or running water." "It has a roof, senor." "That is enough." The simple dignity in her response hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was a woman who was clearly struggling, living in conditions that would make most people complain bitterly, and she was grateful for a roof over her head. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat nervously. "Mr. Blackwood, sir, if I may, Miss Morales has been doing excellent work. She's quiet, respectful, and she works harder than anyone I've seen." "I'm sure she does," Marcus replied, but his attention remained fixed on Catalina. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and her hands, he noticed, were rough from hard work. But it was something else that caught his attention. The way she kept glancing toward the window, as if her thoughts were somewhere else entirely. "Miss Morales?" Marcus said suddenly. "Do you have family here?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. Her composure slipped for just a moment, and Marcus saw something flash across her face. Pain? Fear? Before he could identify it, the mask was back in place. I have a daughter, senor. She is 8 years old. And where is she now? She stays close. I watch over her. It wasn't really an answer, Marcus realized. It was the kind of careful non-answer that people gave when they were trying to avoid saying too much, but it told him what he needed to know. The sick child Jake and Catalina had been discussing was her daughter, and she was probably at the line shack right now. The thought of an 8-year-old girl living in that drafty, cold building made Marcus's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He'd never been particularly sentimental about children, but something about this situation bothered him deeply. Mrs. Patterson, Marcus said without taking his eyes off Catalina, I want you to prepare a room in the main house, the blue guest room on the 2nd floor. Every person in the kitchen stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. Marcus Blackwood was known for being fair to his workers, but he'd never invited any of them to stay in the main house. That was crossing a line that simply wasn't crossed in Montana territory in 1882. Sir, Mrs. Patterson's voice was faint with shock. You heard me. Clean linens, fresh towels, and make sure the fireplace is working properly. Marcus turned back to Catalina, who was looking at him with wide, confused eyes. Miss Morales, you and your daughter will be moving into the main house today. Senor, I cannot accept such kindness. It would not be proper. What's not proper is having a sick child living in an unheated shack. Marcus's voice was sharper than he intended, and he saw Catalina flinch slightly. He forced himself to speak more gently. Consider it a temporary arrangement, until we can find you more suitable accommodations. Catalina stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus found himself holding his breath. There was something happening here, something that went beyond simple employer-employee relations. He couldn't explain it, couldn't even fully understand it, but he knew that everything was about to change. Thank you, senor, Catalina said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. My daughter. She will be grateful. As Marcus turned to leave the kitchen, one thought echoed in his mind like a warning bell. What exactly had he just gotten himself into? The ledger book flew across Marcus's office and slammed into the wall with a crack that echoed through the house like a gunshot. Numbers scattered across the floor in a chaos of ink and fury, while Marcus stood behind his massive oak desk, his chest heaving with rage that threatened to consume everything in its path. $3,000. Gone. Vanished like smoke in a Montana windstorm. Jake! Marcus bellowed, his voice carrying enough force to rattle the windows. Get in here now. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway, and Jake Sullivan appeared in the doorway, his weathered face pale as winter snow. The foreman's hat was clutched in his hands, twisted and wrinkled from nervous fingers that couldn't stay still. You called for me, boss? Marcus pointed at the scattered papers on the floor, his fingers shaking with barely controlled anger. Explain to me how $3,000 just walks away from my ranch accounts. Jake's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal looking for an escape route. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air drifting through the open window. Well, sir, could be a mistake in the cattle count. You know how it is during roundup season. Don't. Marcus's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier shouting. Don't you dare stand there and lie to my face, Jake. I've been counting cattle since before you could tie your own boots. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Outside, the ranch continued its evening routine. Cattle called to each other across the pastures, and somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played a lonely tune. But inside the office, tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Marcus walked around his desk slowly, each step deliberate and measured. Jake flinched as his boss approached, but he held his ground. 15 years of working together meant something, even if trust was cracking like ice in spring. I trusted you, Marcus said, his voice heavy with disappointment that cut deeper than anger. My father trusted you before me. You've eaten at our table, celebrated holidays with our family. And this is how you repay that trust. Marcus, I swear to you. A soft knock interrupted Jake's desperate words. Catalina stood in the doorway, a silver tea service balanced perfectly in her hands. She'd changed from her work clothes into a simple but clean dress, her dark hair pinned neatly at the base of her neck. Even in the midst of his fury, Marcus noticed how she seemed to bring calm into the room just by being there. "Forgive me, senor," she said quietly. "Mrs. Patterson asked me to bring your evening tea." "Not now," Marcus began, but something in Catalina's expression made him stop. She wasn't looking at him. Her dark eyes were fixed on Jake Sullivan with an intensity that made the air in the room feel electric. There was recognition in her gaze. Not the pleasant kind you'd have when meeting an old friend, but something darker. Something that spoke of past hurts and bitter memories. "Actually," Catalina said, setting the tea service down with careful precision, "I couldn't help but hear you mention $3,000. Jake's face went from pale to ashen gray. His hands tightened on his hat until his knuckles showed white against his tan skin. "You don't know what you're talking about, girl." The word girl came out like a curse, filled with contempt and fear. But Catalina didn't back down. If anything, she stood straighter, her chin lifting with a pride that reminded Marcus of a queen facing down her enemies. "I know that amount very well, Senor Sullivan," she said, her accent thickening slightly with emotion. "I've seen it before. In New Mexico, when you worked for the Henderson Ranch." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as pieces of a puzzle he didn't know existed began clicking into place. Jake Sullivan working in New Mexico? He'd never mentioned that in all their years together. "That's impossible," Jake stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "I've never worked in New Mexico. I came here straight from Texas." Catalina's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "My husband was a vaquero for the Hendersons. Miguel Morales. Perhaps you remember him? He was one of the men who went hungry when their wages disappeared." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Marcus stared at his foreman, the man he'd trusted with everything, and saw guilt written across his features as clearly as words on a page. "Miguel Morales," Catalina continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "A good man who worked 16-hour days breaking horses and mending fences. A man who came home to his wife and daughter with empty hands because someone had stolen what he'd earned." Jake's face crumpled like old leather. That was different. The Hendersons were going under anyway. I was just stealing from honest men to line your own pockets," Marcus finished, his voice deadly quiet. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a branding iron. 15 years of friendship and trust, destroyed in a single moment of truth. Marcus felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, exactly, but something close to it. The part of him that believed in loyalty and honor and doing right by the people who depended on you. "Get out," Marcus said. "Marcus, please, let me explain. Get out of my house. Get off my land. If I see you here tomorrow morning, I'll have the sheriff arrest you for theft." Jake Sullivan looked like he wanted to say more, but something in Marcus's expression stopped him. He placed his mangled hat on his head and walked toward the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. At the threshold, he turned back one last time. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt." "But they did," Catalina said softly. "My husband worked himself to death trying to make up for what you stole. He died believing he'd failed his family." Jake's face went white as bone, and then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hallway and out into the Montana night. Marcus and Catalina stood alone in the office, surrounded by scattered papers and the ruins of trust. The silence between them was different now. Not awkward or uncomfortable, but heavy with shared understanding. "Thank you," Marcus said finally. Catalina nodded, her eyes still bright with unshed tears. "Justice doesn't bring back the dead, but it helps the living sleep better." As she turned to leave, Marcus found himself studying her profile in the lamplight. There was strength in the line of her jaw, grace in the way she moved. She just helped him expose a thief who'd been stealing from him for years. But more than that, she'd shown him what real courage looked like. "Catalina," he called as she reached the door. She paused, looking back at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "Your husband sounds like he was a good man." A sad smile crossed her face. He was the best man I ever knew, Senor. Until tonight, I thought all his kind had died with him. And then she was gone, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that everything he thought he knew about his life was about to change. Thunder crashed overhead like the world was splitting apart, and 8-year-old Isabella Morales cried out in her sleep, her small body burning with fever that turned her dreams into nightmares. Lightning illuminated the tiny line shack in stark white flashes, revealing the desperate scene inside where a mother fought death itself with nothing but love and stubborn will. Catalina pressed a cool cloth to her daughter's forehead, whispering prayers in Spanish that seemed to get lost in the howling wind. The storm had rolled in fast and mean, turning the Montana sky black as coal and sending rain down in sheets that drummed against the shack's thin walls like bullets. "Mija, stay with me," Catalina whispered, her voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. "Don't leave Mama. Please don't leave Mama." Outside, the storm raged with the fury of nature unleashed. Trees bent nearly in half under the assault of wind and rain, their branches scratching against the shack's roof like skeletal fingers. But inside, an even fiercer battle was being fought, a mother's love against a child's failing strength. Isabella stirred, her dark eyes fluttering open for a moment. They were Miguel's eyes, Catalina realized with a pain that cut deeper than any knife. Her daughter had her father's gentle spirit, his way of finding joy in simple things. Now those eyes were dull with sickness, and Catalina felt her heart breaking all over again. "Mama!" Isabella's voice was barely a whisper, weak as a dying breeze. "I'm here, little star. Mama's here. I'm cold." Catalina pulled the thin blanket higher, though it provided little warmth against the chill that seeped through every crack in the old building. The fireplace gave off some heat, but not enough. Never enough. She'd already burned through most of their small supply of wood, and dawn was still hours away. A branch cracked somewhere outside, followed by a tremendous crash that shook the entire shack. Isabella whimpered and pressed closer to her mother, seeking comfort that Catalina desperately wanted to provide, but felt powerless to give. Through the storm, Catalina heard something that made her heart stop. Hoofbeats. Someone was riding through this terrible weather, heading toward their little shelter. Fear gripped her throat like an iron fist. Who would be out in such weather? Jake Sullivan, coming to finish what he'd started? Or maybe bandits, drawn by rumors of a defenseless woman and child? Catalina reached for the old hunting knife that had belonged to Miguel, her fingers closing around its worn handle. She might not be able to protect Isabella from sickness, but she could defend her from human threats. The hoofbeats stopped just outside the shack. Heavy footsteps splashed through the mud, approaching the door with purpose. Catalina held her breath, positioning herself between the entrance and Isabella's makeshift bed. Lightning flashed again, throwing crazy shadows across the walls. A firm knock echoed through the small space. "Catalina? It's Marcus Blackwood. I saw smoke from your chimney." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. She set down the knife and hurried to open the door, rain immediately slashing into the room like liquid ice. Marcus stood on the threshold, soaked to the skin and leading his horse by the reins. His expensive coat was plastered to his body, and his dark hair dripped water down his face. But his eyes, those intense blue eyes, were focused entirely on her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What are you doing here?" Catalina asked, having to shout over the wind. "I came to check on you and Isabella." He glanced past her to where the child lay shivering under her blanket. "My God, she looks terrible. The fever won't break. I've tried everything I know, but—" Catalina's voice trailed off. What was the point of explaining? There was nothing anyone could do without proper medicine, and medicine cost money she didn't have. Marcus stepped inside without being invited, bringing his horse into the cramped space behind him. The animal snorted and shook, sending water droplets flying, but at least it was out of the storm. "How long has she been like this?" Marcus asked, kneeling beside Isabella's bed. 3 days, maybe 4. Time doesn't mean much when you're watching your child die. The words hung between them like a confession. Catalina had tried to stay strong, tried to keep hope alive, but seeing Marcus here, this powerful man who could buy and sell her troubles without thinking twice, made her realize how desperate her situation really was. Marcus reached out and gently touched Isabella's forehead with the back of his hand. The child stirred at his touch, her eyes opening slightly. "Uncle Marcus?" Isabella whispered, and Catalina felt her heart skip a beat. When had her daughter started calling him that? And why did it sound so natural? "I'm here, little one," Marcus said softly. "How are you feeling?" "Tired and cold. Mama says I'm sick." "Mama's right, but we're going to take care of you." Isabella smiled weakly before her eyes drifted closed again. The simple interaction seemed to have drained what little energy she had left. Marcus stood up slowly, his face grim in the firelight. When he looked at Catalina, she saw something in his expression that made her stomach clench with new fear. "She needs a doctor," he said quietly. "Doctors cost money. I have money. And I have pride." They stared at each other across the small space, both stubborn as mountain stone. Rain continued to hammer the roof, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like God's own anger. "Your pride won't save her life," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. Catalina felt tears burning behind her eyes. Tears of exhaustion, fear, and frustration all mixed together. "You don't understand. I've spent my whole life taking care of myself and my daughter. I don't know how to accept charity from strangers. I'm not a stranger. Not anymore." The words were simple, but they carried weight that settled somewhere deep in Catalina's chest. She looked at this man, this wealthy rancher who had every reason to stay in his warm, comfortable house, and tried to understand why he was here, soaking wet and worried about a sick child who wasn't even his responsibility. Another flash of lightning lit up the shack, and in that brief moment, Catalina saw something that made her breath catch. Marcus wasn't looking at Isabella like she was just another employee's child. He was looking at her with the protective concern of someone who genuinely cared. "Why?" Catalina asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Why does it matter to you what happens to us?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying Isabella's pale face in the flickering firelight. When he finally spoke, his words were so soft that Catalina had to strain to hear them. "Because I've spent 10 years building walls around myself, convincing myself that money and land were enough, that I didn't need anyone." He looked up at her, and in his eyes, she saw a loneliness that matched her own. "But watching you fight for her life, seeing how much you love her, it made me realize what I've been missing." Thunder crashed overhead again, but somehow the sound seemed less threatening now. In the warm glow of the fire, with rain pattering on the roof and Isabella breathing softly between them, something shifted in the air. Not romance, it was too soon and too complicated for that, but understanding, recognition. Two people who had built walls around their hearts, slowly realizing they didn't have to carry their burdens alone. "I'll ride to town tomorrow," Marcus said. "Dr. Henley owes me a favor." Catalina nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Montana landscape, but inside the little shack, hope flickered back to life like a candle relit in the darkness. Gunshots cracked through the morning air like whips, sending birds exploding from the trees in a panic of wings and frightened cries. Marcus jerked awake in his chair beside Isabella's bed, his hand automatically reaching for the pistol at his hip as his eyes searched the dawn light streaming through the guest room windows. Two riders sat on horseback at the edge of his property, their badges glinting silver in the early sun like tiny mirrors. U.S. Marshals. Marcus's blood turned to ice water in his veins as he recognized the type of men who brought nothing but trouble to peaceful ranches. "Catalina," he whispered urgently, gently shaking her shoulder. She'd fallen asleep curled up in the chair on the other side of Isabella's bed, her dark hair falling across her face like a curtain. She stirred, blinking in confusion before her eyes focused on his face. "What's wrong?" "Marshals. Two of them just rode up." Marcus moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. "They're not here for a social visit." Isabella shifted on the bed, her fever finally broken after 3 days of Dr. Henley's care and medicine. The color had returned to her cheeks, and she breathed easily now, no longer fighting for each breath like she had during the worst of her sickness. Catalina joined Marcus at the window, her body tense with the kind of fear that came from experience with lawmen who asked hard questions. What could they want? Jake Sullivan. Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched the marshals dismount and tie their horses to the hitching post. Must be about that missing money. But there's more to it than just ranch business. Heavy boots stomped across the wooden porch, followed by sharp knocks that echoed through the house like gunshots. Marcus straightened his shoulders, smoothing down his hair and checking his appearance in the mirror. Whatever these men wanted, he'd face them as the owner of the Blackwood Ranch, not as a man with secrets to hide. Stay here with Isabella, he told Catalina. Whatever happens, don't come downstairs unless I call for you. But as Marcus reached the door, he heard Mrs. Patterson's voice from the kitchen, high and nervous. Marshals, sirs. Mr. Blackwood will be right down. Can I offer you coffee? Fresh biscuits? No thank you, ma'am, came a gruff reply. We're here on official business. Marcus descended the stairs, each step measured and deliberate. The two marshals stood in his front hall, their spurs jangling softly as they shifted their weight. Both men were seasoned lawmen. Marcus could tell by the way they positioned themselves to watch all the exits, their hands resting casually near their weapons. Gentlemen, Marcus said, extending his hand. I'm Marcus Blackwood. What can I do for you? The older marshal, a man with gray whiskers and sharp eyes, stepped forward. Marshal Tom Reynolds, U.S. Marshal Service. This is my deputy, Marshal Collins. We're tracking a man named Jake Sullivan. Understand he worked for you? He did. Past tense. I fired him 3 days ago for theft. What kind of theft? Marcus chose his words carefully. Missing money from ranch accounts. $3,000. The marshals exchanged glances that spoke of information Marcus wasn't privy to. Deputy Collins, a younger man with a scar across his chin, pulled out a small notebook and began writing. Mr. Blackwood, Marshal Reynolds continued, we have reason to believe Jake Sullivan has been involved in stealing federal cattle money across 3 territories. The theft from your ranch might be connected to a larger operation. Federal cattle money. Marcus felt his stomach drop like a stone down a well. This wasn't just about ranch business anymore. This was about the kind of crimes that could put a man in prison for life. I'm willing to cooperate fully, Marcus said, but I should mention that I had help discovering Sullivan's theft. One of my employees recognized him from previous crimes. We'd like to speak with this employee. Marcus hesitated. Bringing Catalina into this conversation meant exposing her to scrutiny from federal lawmen. It meant questions about her background, her legal status, her relationship to him. In 1882 Montana Territory, a wealthy white rancher and a Mexican woman living under the same roof raised eyebrows that could lead to serious trouble. Of course, Marcus said finally. Catalina, could you come down here, please? Footsteps on the stairs, and then Catalina appeared, her hands folded in front of her, her expression calm but guarded. She changed into her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes and pinned her hair back neatly. Gentlemen, this is Mrs. Catalina Morales, Marcus said. She's the one who recognized Sullivan. Marshal Reynolds tipped his hat politely, but his eyes were sharp as he studied Catalina. Ma'am, understand you knew Jake Sullivan before he worked here? Yes, sir. He worked for the Henderson Ranch in New Mexico. My husband was a vaquero there. Your husband? Miguel Morales. He died 2 years ago. The marshal made notes in his book. And you say Sullivan stole money there too? $3,000. Same amount as here. Wages for the vaqueros disappeared, and my husband worked himself to death trying to make up for what his family lost. Marcus watched Catalina as she spoke, admiring the quiet strength in her voice. She was telling these federal lawmen exactly what had happened, holding nothing back despite the obvious danger of drawing their attention. That's quite a coincidence, Deputy Collins said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe in coincidences. You following Sullivan from New Mexico to Montana? The question hung in the air like smoke from a branding iron. Marcus felt his muscles tense. recognizing the trap being laid. If Catalina had followed Sullivan for revenge, that might make her a suspect rather than a witness. "I came to Montana Territory looking for work," Catalina said evenly. "I have a daughter to support. I didn't know Sullivan was here until I heard his voice behind the stable." "And where is this daughter now?" "Upstairs. She's been sick, but she's recovering." Marshal Reynolds closed his notebook with a snap. "We'll need to verify your story, ma'am. Check with folks in New Mexico. Make sure everything matches up." "I understand. And we'll need to know your exact relationship to Mr. Blackwood here. Seems unusual. A ranch owner taking such personal interest in the family problems of his hired help." The silence that followed was heavy as a thundercloud. Marcus felt every eye in the room on him, waiting for his answer. This was the moment of truth, the moment when he had to decide whether to protect Catalina by telling a lie that preserved social conventions, or tell the truth that could destroy them both. "Mrs. Morales saved me from a significant financial loss," Marcus said carefully. "I consider that service worth protecting." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was too complicated, too dangerous, and too precious to share with strangers who might use it against them. "I see," Marshal Reynolds said, though his tone suggested he saw more than Marcus was comfortable with. "Well, we'll be in touch. Don't plan on leaving the territory anytime soon, either of you." As the marshals prepared to leave, Deputy Collins turned back with one final question. "Oh, and Mr. Blackwood? You wouldn't happen to know where Jake Sullivan might have gone, would you?" Marcus met the man's eyes steadily. "If I knew that, Marshal, I'd have tracked him down myself to get my money back." After the lawman rode away, Marcus and Catalina stood in the hallway, both understanding that their lives had just become infinitely more complicated. Whatever was growing between them would now be examined under the harsh light of federal investigation. "They don't believe us," Catalina said quietly. "No," Marcus agreed. "They don't." From upstairs came Isabella's voice, calling for her mother. Normal life was calling them back, but Marcus knew that nothing would ever be quite normal again. The wedding dress hung in the closet like a ghost from another life. Its white silk yellowed with age and dreams that had died with the man who was supposed to see Catalina wear it. She touched the fabric with trembling fingers, remembering Miguel's promises about their future together. Promises that had been buried in New Mexico soil along with his broken body. "Mama, why are you crying?" Isabella's voice from the doorway made Catalina quickly wipe her eyes. The child had been recovering well from her fever, but she still looked pale and thin, like a flower that had survived a harsh winter but wasn't quite ready to bloom again. "I'm not crying, Mija. Just thinking about your papa." Isabella padded across the guest room on bare feet, her nightgown too big for her small frame. She'd grown so much in the past few months, but the sickness had made her seem fragile again, like something that might break if held too tightly. "Do you miss him very much?" Catalina knelt down to Isabella's level, gathering her daughter into her arms. The child smelled like lavender soap and childhood innocence, scents that reminded Catalina of everything she was fighting to protect. Everyday little star. But missing someone doesn't mean we stop living. "Uncle Marcus makes you smile," Isabella said with the blunt honesty that only children possessed. "Papa would want you to smile." The words hit Catalina like a gentle blow to the chest. Children saw things that adults tried to hide, understood truths that grown-ups made complicated with fear and social rules. "Isabella, you must understand something important," Catalina said carefully. "Uncle Marcus is a good man, but he's not family. He's our employer, and we must remember our place. But he loves us." 3 simple words that contained a world of complication. Catalina had seen the way Marcus looked at Isabella, the tenderness in his voice when he read her bedtime stories, the protective anger in his eyes when he discovered her illness. And yes, she'd also seen the way he looked at her, with a longing that made her heart race and her practical mind sound alarm bells. "Love isn't always enough, Mija. Sometimes people from different worlds can't be together, no matter how much they care for each other." Isabella frowned, her 8-year-old brain struggling with concepts that shouldn't have to concern children. "Why not?" Before Catalina could answer, A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus's voice came through the wood, hesitant and formal. "Catalina? Could I speak with you for a moment?" She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his dark hair slightly disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. His blue eyes were troubled, and there was tension in his shoulders that spoke of difficult decisions. "Of course, Senor. Isabella, go wash your face and hands for breakfast." The child scampered away, leaving them alone in the hallway. Marcus looked like he wanted to say something important but couldn't find the right words. Finally, he gestured toward the stairs. "Walk with me? I need to discuss something with you." They made their way through the house in silence, past the kitchen where Mrs. Patterson was preparing breakfast, past the formal dining room where Marcus ate his meals alone, and out onto the front porch where the morning air was crisp with approaching autumn. "The Marshalls came back yesterday while you were in town with Isabella," Marcus said without preamble. "They've been asking questions about us, about our arrangement." Catalina felt her stomach tighten with familiar fear. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest they think there's more to our relationship than employer and employee." Marcus gripped the porch railing, his knuckles white with tension. "Apparently, people in town are talking. A wealthy rancher and a Mexican woman living under the same roof. Her child calling me Uncle Marcus." "I'll leave," Catalina said immediately. "Isabella and I will pack our things and—" "No." The word came out sharper than Marcus intended. He turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch. "That's not what I want. What you want and what's wise are two different things, Senor. Stop calling me that. My name is Marcus. I know your name. Then use it. Please." They stood there in the morning light, two people balanced on the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next word spoken would determine whether they stepped back to safety or jumped into the unknown. "Marcus?" Catalina said softly, and the sound of his name on her lips did something to his expression that made her heart beat faster. "This is dangerous. For both of us, but especially for you. I don't care about danger. You should. You have everything to lose, your reputation, your business, your standing in the community. I have nothing left to lose. But you think I have everything?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I have money and land and a big empty house. I have business associates who respect my bank account and neighbors who invite me to dinner because I'm useful to them. But I don't have anyone who cares if I live or die." "That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time someone worried about me when I was late coming home? When was the last time someone asked about my day because they genuinely wanted to know? When was the last time someone looked at me and saw Marcus the man instead of Blackwood the rancher?" Catalina felt tears prick her eyes, because she knew exactly what he meant. After Miguel's death, she'd been so focused on survival that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than just a problem to be solved. "The Marshalls aren't our only concern," she said quietly. "People in town are already suspicious. If this goes any further, there will be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "The kind that could hurt Isabella. Children can be cruel when they don't understand something. And adults." She shook her head. "Adults can be worse." Marcus stepped closer, and Catalina caught the scent of his shaving soap mixed with leather and something uniquely him. When he spoke, his voice was low and intense. "What if I told you I don't care what people think? What if I told you that, for the first time in 10 years, I wake up looking forward to the day because I know you and Isabella will be there? What if I told you that watching you fight for her life made me realize what courage really looks like?" "I would say you're a fool," Catalina whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe I am, but I'm a fool who knows what he wants." "And what do you want?" Marcus reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose. When she didn't move, he gently touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I want you to stay, not as my employee but as my family. I want to be Isabella's father in more than just name. I want to wake up every morning knowing that you're both safe and happy and home." "Marcus, I want to marry you, Catalina. I want to give you my name and my protection and everything I have. I want to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the gift of your love." The words hung between them like a bridge over a canyon, beautiful and terrifying and impossible to ignore. Somewhere in the distance, cattle were lowing in the pastures, and the sound seemed to emphasize the vastness of the choice before them. "The world isn't ready for what you're suggesting," Catalina said, though her heart was singing with hope she'd thought was dead forever. "Then we'll help make it ready," Marcus replied. "One day at a time, one person at a time, starting with us." And as the Montana sun climbed higher in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility, Catalina Morales found herself believing that maybe, just maybe, love really could conquer all. Flames licked at the barn's wooden walls like hungry demons, casting dancing shadows across the ranch yard as smoke billowed black against the star-filled Montana sky. Marcus ran toward the inferno, his boots pounding against the hard-packed earth while behind him, ranch hands scrambled to form bucket brigades that seemed pitiful against the roaring monster devouring his property. "The horses!" someone shouted above the crackling roar. "They're still inside." Marcus didn't hesitate. He plunged through the barn's main door, the heat hitting him like a physical wall that tried to drive him back. Smoke burned his lungs and stung his eyes, but he pushed deeper into the building where terrified animals screamed and kicked at their stall doors. Through the chaos, he heard something that made his blood freeze. A child's voice, high and frightened, calling for help from somewhere in the smoke. "Isabella!" Marcus roared, his voice barely audible over the fire's hunger. "Where are you?" "Uncle Marcus. I'm here. I can't get out." The voice came from the feed room at the back of the barn, where Isabella had probably been playing with the barn cats like she did every evening after supper. Marcus fought his way through the smoke, his lungs burning with each breath, his shirt already singed from flying sparks. He found her huddled in the corner, tears streaming down her soot-covered face as she cradled a small gray kitten against her chest. The doorway behind her was blocked by a fallen beam, flames creeping closer with each passing second. "I tried to save Whiskers," Isabella sobbed. "I couldn't leave him to burn." Marcus swept her into his arms, kitten and all, his heart hammering against his ribs as he searched for another way out. The main door was becoming impossible to reach, but there was a window, high up, but wide enough for them to squeeze through. "Hold tight to me," Marcus commanded, grabbing a nearby pitchfork to smash the window glass. Cool night air rushed in like salvation, and Marcus lifted Isabella toward the opening. "I can't fit," she cried, her small body shaking with fear. "Yes, you can. I'm gonna boost you up and you're gonna climb out. Mrs. Patterson is waiting for you outside." With strength born of desperation, Marcus lifted Isabella high enough to reach the window. She scrambled through, still clutching the kitten, and dropped safely into Mrs. Patterson's waiting arms on the other side. A burning timber crashed down where they'd been standing just moments before, sending sparks flying like angry fireflies. Marcus pulled himself through the window, his hands scraped and bleeding from the broken glass, just as the roof began to collapse behind him. "Marcus!" Catalina's voice cut through the night air like a blade. She was running toward them, her dark hair streaming behind her, her face white with terror. "Isabella! Mi amor, are you hurt?" "I'm okay, Mama," Isabella said, though her voice was shaky. "Uncle Marcus saved me and Whiskers too." Catalina's eyes met Marcus's over Isabella's head, and in that moment, he saw something that made his chest tighten with emotion. It wasn't just gratitude or relief. It was love, pure and simple, shining in her dark eyes like stars reflected in deep water. But their moment of reunion was interrupted by angry voices from the crowd that had gathered to watch the fire. Ranch hands and neighbors formed a loose circle around them, and Marcus could see suspicion and hostility in too many faces. "Mighty convenient," drawled a voice from the crowd. "Fire starts right after them federal marshals come asking questions." Marcus turned to see Pete Hawkins, a neighboring rancher who'd never liked the Blackwood family's success. Pete's face was twisted with the kind of mean satisfaction that came from seeing others suffer. "You saying I burned down my own barn, Pete?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm saying it's strange how much trouble you've been having since you took up with that Mexican woman, Pete replied, spitting into the dirt. First Jake Sullivan turns out to be a thief. Then federal marshals start sniffing around. Now your barn burns down. Makes a man wonder. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Marcus felt the atmosphere shift from concern to suspicion. These people had known him all his life, but that didn't seem to matter when faced with something they didn't understand. Watch your mouth, Hawkins, Marcus warned, stepping forward. You're talking about my family. Your family? Pete laughed, an ugly sound that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. That what you're calling it now? A rich white man shacking up with some Mexican woman and her kid. The insult hung in the air like smoke from the burning barn. Marcus felt his hands clench into fists, but before he could respond, Catalina stepped forward, her chin raised with quiet dignity. My name is Catalina Morales, she said clearly, her voice carrying despite the crackling flames behind them. I am a widow, and I work for Mr. Blackwood. My daughter and I are grateful for his kindness, but we are not what you think we are. Then what are you? Pete challenged. Because folks in town have been talking, and they say a lot of things, interrupted a new voice. Dr. Henley pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in his hand and his expression stern. Most of it nonsense from people who have nothing better to do than gossip about their neighbors. The doctor's arrival seemed to calm the crowd slightly. Dr. Henley was respected in the community, and his opinions carried weight with people who might otherwise listen to troublemakers like Pete Hawkins. I've treated this child, Dr. Henley continued, gesturing toward Isabella. I've seen how Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Morales care for her. If that's not family, then I don't know what is. But it ain't proper, Pete insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier venom. A man like Blackwood should marry his own kind. A man like Blackwood should marry whoever makes him happy, came another voice from the crowd. Mrs. Patterson had spoken, her arms still wrapped protectively around Isabella. And if you ask me, he's been happier these past few months than I've seen him in years. More murmurs from the crowd, but these sounded less hostile. Marcus realized that he had more supporters than enemies, even if the enemies were louder. The fire's out, announced one of the ranch hands, approaching with his hat in his hands. Barn's a total loss, but we saved the horses. All except what? Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. Except we found evidence of arson, boss. Someone poured kerosene around the base of the walls and lit it deliberate. The crowd fell silent, the implications of this news settling over them like a blanket. This wasn't an accident or an act of God. This was an attack, pure and simple. Who would do such a thing? Dr. Henley asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. Marcus looked around at the faces in the crowd, noting who was there and who wasn't. His eyes met Catalina's, and he saw the same realization dawning in her expression. Someone who wanted to send a message, Marcus said quietly. Someone who thinks fear is stronger than love. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the night. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden by bandanas, their hands resting on their weapons. The leader of the group spoke in a voice muffled by his mask. This is just the beginning, Blackwood. Send the woman and her kid packing, or next time it won't be just a barn that burns. Before anyone could respond, the riders wheeled their horses around and galloped away into the Montana night, leaving behind only the smell of smoke and the bitter taste of fear. Marcus felt Catalina's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his own. In that simple gesture, he found the strength to face whatever came next. Well, he said to the crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. I guess that settles the question of what we're dealing with. But even as he spoke, Marcus knew that the real battle was just beginning. The church bells rang out across the valley like silver coins dropping into a crystal bowl, their pure sound carrying promises of new beginnings to everyone within miles of the small wooden building. Marcus stood at the altar in his best black suit, his heart pounding so hard he was sure the whole congregation could hear it echoing off the walls. Today was his wedding day, and he'd never been more terrified or more certain of anything in his entire life. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews where friends and neighbors sat in their Sunday finest. Some faces were friendly, others curious, and a few were openly disapproving, but they were all here, witnessing this moment that would change everything. Dr. Henley stood beside Marcus as his best man, his weathered face creased with a smile that spoke of genuine happiness for his friend. The old doctor had been one of the first to accept Marcus's decision to marry Catalina, and his support had helped sway others in the community. "You ready for this?" Dr. Henley whispered, adjusting his tie. "Been ready for months," Marcus replied, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Just waiting for her to say yes." The church door opened with a soft creak, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. Catalina stood in the doorway like a vision, wearing a dress of cream-colored silk that transformed her from the hard-working woman he'd fallen in love with into something that belonged in a fairy tale. But it was her eyes that captured him. Those deep, coffee-colored eyes that had seen too much sorrow but still held hope for the future. She was looking at him with an expression that made his chest tighten with emotion. A mixture of love and trust and quiet determination that said she was ready to face whatever came next. Isabella walked beside her mother, dressed in a miniature version of the same cream silk, her dark hair adorned with wildflowers that she'd picked that morning. The child was practically glowing with excitement, her steps bouncing with barely contained joy. Mrs. Patterson played the wedding march on the small organ, her fingers dancing across the keys with surprising skill. The melody filled the church, sweet and solemn, as Catalina walked slowly down the aisle toward Marcus. Each step brought her closer, and with each step, Marcus felt more certain that this was right. Not just right for him, but right for all of them, him, Catalina, Isabella, and the family they were creating together. When Catalina reached the altar, she handed her bouquet of wildflowers to Isabella and took Marcus's offered hand. Her fingers were warm and steady, and the simple touch sent strength flowing through him like electricity. Reverend Morrison opened his Bible, his voice carrying clearly through the small church. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Marcus Blackwood and Catalina Morales in holy matrimony." The words washed over Marcus like a blessing, but he found himself focused more on Catalina's face than on the ceremony itself. She was looking at him with complete attention, as if he were the only person in the world, and the love in her expression made him feel like the richest man in Montana territory. "Marriage is not a union to be entered into lightly," Reverend Morrison continued, "but with reverence, discretion, and in the fear of God. If any person can show just cause why these two should not be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Marcus tensed, half expecting Pete Hawkins or one of the other troublemakers to stand up and voice an objection. But the quiet stretched on, broken only by the soft cooing of a baby somewhere in the back pews. "Marcus," Reverend Morrison said, "do you take Catalina to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Marcus said, his voice strong and clear. "With all my heart, I do." "And Catalina, do you take Marcus to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Catalina's answer came in a voice that was soft but unwavering. "I do. Before God and these witnesses, I do." The ring ceremony passed in a blur of emotion. Marcus slipped the simple gold band onto Catalina's finger, marveling at how right it looked there, how complete it made her hand appear. When she placed his ring on his finger, her touch was gentle but sure, and the weight of the gold felt like a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana," Reverend Morrison announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Marcus, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was soft and sweet, lasting only a moment but containing a lifetime of promises. When they separated, Marcus saw tears of joy in Catalina's eyes, and he felt his own throat tighten with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Morrison said with a smile, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Blackwood, The congregation erupted in applause, the sound filling the small church like thunder. Isabella clapped her hands together with delight, and somewhere in the back, Mrs. Patterson was crying openly into her handkerchief. As they walked back down the aisle together, Marcus felt like he was floating. Catalina's hand was tucked into his arm, her face radiant with happiness, and Isabella skipped alongside them, scattering flower petals from her basket. Outside the church, the whole community had gathered for the reception. Tables were set up under the cottonwood trees, laden with food that neighbors had brought to share. A fiddle player had arrived from town, and the sound of music drifted across the valley like birdsong. But even in the midst of celebration, Marcus noticed the tensions that still existed. Some folks were genuinely happy for them, clapping Marcus on the back and kissing Catalina's cheek with warm congratulations. Others stood in small groups, whispering among themselves and casting uncertain glances at the newlyweds. "Don't mind them," Dr. Henley said quietly, appearing at Marcus's elbow with a glass of punch. "Change is hard for some people. They'll come around." "And if they don't?" Marcus asked, watching Pete Hawkins mutter something to his wife that made her frown. "Then that's their loss," Dr. Henley replied. "You've got something precious here, Marcus. Don't let anyone make you ashamed of it." As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself relaxing into the celebration. Isabella charmed everyone with her bright smile and her excited chatter about having a papa now. Catalina moved through the crowd with quiet grace, accepting congratulations and compliments on her dress with the same dignity she brought to everything else. The high point of the day came when the fiddle player struck up a waltz, and Marcus led his new wife onto the makeshift dance floor that had been set up in the grass. They moved together as if they'd been dancing for years, and Marcus felt like he could hold her forever. "Happy?" he asked, spinning her gently under his arm. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," Catalina replied, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. "Good," Marcus said, pulling her close, "because this is just the beginning." As the sun began to set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Marcus looked around at the celebration surrounding them. His friends and neighbors, his new wife, his daughter, because Isabella was his daughter now, in every way that mattered, and the future spreading out before them like an unwritten book full of possibilities. For the first time in his life, Marcus Blackwood felt truly wealthy, and it had nothing to do with money or land or cattle. It had everything to do with love, and the family he'd found when he'd stopped looking for it. The wedding was over, but their life together was just beginning. Snow fell like tiny diamonds from the gray December sky, covering the Blackwood ranch in a blanket of white that made everything look pure and new. Marcus stood at the kitchen window, watching his breath fog the glass as he searched the horizon for any sign of the riders who had been terrorizing their neighbors for weeks. 3 months had passed since the wedding, and what should have been the happiest time of his life had become a constant battle against fear. The masked men who had burned his barn weren't finished with their campaign of terror. They'd struck again and again, always in the darkness, always leaving behind messages of hate and violence. "Any sign of them?" Catalina asked from behind him, her voice tight with the worry that had become their constant companion. Marcus shook his head, still scanning the white landscape. "Nothing yet, but they'll come. They always do when the moon is dark." Isabella sat at the kitchen table, her small hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that no 8-year-old should have to carry. She'd grown quiet over the past few weeks, jumping at every unexpected sound, clinging to Marcus and Catalina like they might disappear if she let go. "Papa," she whispered, using the name that still made Marcus's heart swell every time he heard it. "Why do those men want to hurt us?" It was the question Marcus dreaded most because he couldn't give her an answer that would make sense to a child's mind. How could he explain hatred to someone who saw the world through eyes full of love? How could he tell her that some people were so afraid of change that they'd rather destroy than understand? "Some people are scared of things they don't know," Marcus said finally, moving away from the window to sit beside her. "And when people are scared, sometimes they do mean things." "But we're not scary," Isabella protested, her voice small and confused. "We're just a family." "Yes, we are," Marcus said, pulling her onto his lap. And that's what makes us strong. Families stick together, no matter what. A sharp knock at the front door made them all freeze. Marcus's hand moved automatically to the rifle he kept propped against the wall. But before he could reach it, a familiar voice called out. Marcus, it's Dr. Henley. Let me in. Marcus opened the door to find his friend standing on the porch, his medical bag in one hand and a worried expression on his weathered face. Snow clung to his coat and hat, and his cheeks were red from the cold. Thank God you're all right, Dr. Henley said, stamping his feet to shake off the snow. I just came from the Morrison place. They hit it last night. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. How bad? Bad. Burned down their chicken coop, killed half their livestock. Left a message nailed to their front door. Dr. Henley's voice was grim. Said anyone who supports you and your family would get the same treatment. Catalina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The Morrisons have been nothing but kind to us. Reverend Morrison married us in his church. That's exactly why they were targeted, Dr. Henley said. These men aren't just after you anymore, Marcus. They're going after anyone who shows you friendship or support. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. It was one thing for him to face danger. He'd chosen this path when he decided to marry Catalina. But knowing that innocent people were suffering because of his choices made his stomach churn with guilt and rage. I have to stop this, Marcus said, his jaw tight with determination. I can't let other people pay for my decisions. How? Catalina asked, her voice sharp with fear. These men hide behind masks and strike in the darkness. They're cowards, but they're dangerous cowards. I know who they are, Dr. Henley said quietly, his words falling into the room like stones into still water. Everyone turned to stare at him. The doctor looked older than his years, his face etched with lines of worry and moral struggle. You know? Marcus demanded. How long have you known? I've suspected for weeks. But tonight, when I was treating Mrs. Morrison's burns, I saw something that confirmed it. Dr. Henley reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of torn fabric. This was caught on a fence post near their barn. Expensive wool, the kind only wealthy men wear. Marcus took the fabric, examining it in the lamplight. It was indeed high-quality material, dyed a deep blue that reminded him of something he'd seen recently. Pete Hawkins was wearing a coat this color at the wedding, Catalina said softly. I remember because his wife complained about how much it cost. Pete's involved, but he's not the leader, Dr. Henley said. The man giving the orders is someone with real power in this community. Someone who sees your marriage as a threat to the natural order of things. Who? Marcus asked, though a sick feeling in his stomach suggested he already knew the answer. Judge Morrison's brother, Calvin. He's been organizing meetings at his ranch, bringing together men who share his views about keeping the races separate. Dr. Henley's voice was heavy with disgust. They call themselves the Montana Purity Society. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Calvin Morrison was one of the most respected men in the territory, a former territorial legislator who still held enormous influence over local politics and business. If he was behind the attacks, it meant Marcus wasn't just fighting a few disgruntled neighbors. He was up against a coordinated campaign backed by real power and money. We have to leave, Catalina said suddenly, her voice breaking. We have to take Isabella and go somewhere safe. No. Marcus's voice was firm, though his heart was breaking at the fear in his wife's eyes. We don't run. This is our home, our land, our life. We don't give it up because of threats from cowards who hide behind masks. But what about Isabella? Catalina's voice rose with desperation. What about our neighbors who are getting hurt because they support us? How many people have to suffer before we admit that love isn't enough? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Marcus looked at his daughter, seeing the fear in her young eyes, then at his wife, seeing the pain and terror that was tearing her apart. These were the two people he loved most in the world, and his choices were putting them in danger. But running away wouldn't solve anything. It would just teach Isabella that when things got difficult, the answer was to give up. It would tell the community that hatred was stronger than love, that fear was more powerful than justice. "Love is enough," Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised even him. "But sometimes love has to fight for what's right." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the ranch in pristine white that would show the tracks of anyone who approached in the darkness. Marcus knew that before morning came, they would face their greatest test yet. But for the first time in months, he felt ready for whatever came next. He had his family, he had friends like Dr. Henley who were willing to stand with him, and he had something that Calvin Morrison and his followers would never understand: the unshakable belief that love, real love, was worth fighting for. The battle for their future was about to begin. The courthouse steps were slick with morning frost as Marcus climbed toward the massive wooden doors, his boots echoing against the stone like a drumbeat announcing his arrival. In his hand, he carried a leather folder containing evidence that would either save his family or destroy everything they'd built together. 6 months had passed since the last attack, 6 months of legal battles and community meetings and sleepless nights wondering if justice would ever come to the Montana territory. Today, the truth would finally be revealed, and the future of the Blackwood family would be decided by 12 men who held their fate in their hands. "You ready for this?" Dr. Henley asked, falling into step beside Marcus as they approached the courthouse entrance. "As ready as I'll ever be," Marcus replied, though his stomach was twisted into knots that felt like they might never come undone. Inside the courthouse, every seat was filled with people from across the territory who had come to witness what the newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Marcus spotted familiar faces in the crowd, some friendly, others hostile, all watching him with the intense curiosity that comes when a community is about to judge one of its own. Catalina sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes fixed on Marcus with a mixture of love and fear that made his chest ache. Isabella sat beside her, dressed in her best blue dress, her small face serious beyond her 9 years, as she tried to understand the adult world that had suddenly become so complicated. Judge Harrison called the court to order, his gavel striking the wooden block with authority that silenced the murmuring crowd. The old judge had a reputation for fairness, but Marcus knew that even fair men could be swayed by popular opinion and social pressure. "The territory of Montana versus Calvin Morrison and Associates," Judge Harrison announced. "The defendants are charged with arson, destruction of property, terroristic threats, and conspiracy to commit violence." Calvin Morrison sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit and silver hair making him look like the respected citizen he'd always pretended to be. But Marcus could see the arrogance in his eyes, the certainty that his money and connections would protect him from any real consequences. The prosecutor, a young man named David Walsh, stood to address the jury. "Gentlemen, we are here today because a small group of men decided that their hatred was more important than the law. They decided that their fear of change justified violence against innocent families." Walsh outlined the case methodically, presenting evidence of the barn burning, the attacks on neighbors, the threatening messages left at various homes. With each piece of evidence, Marcus felt the weight of months of terror being lifted from his shoulders and placed where it belonged, on the men who had caused it. "The defense will try to convince you that these men were protecting their community," Walsh continued. "But I ask you to consider this: what kind of community needs protection from a family? What kind of values require violence to defend them?" When the defense attorney rose to speak, Marcus felt his optimism flicker like a candle in the wind. The man was skilled, painting Calvin Morrison as a concerned citizen who had been driven to desperate measures by the breakdown of social order. "My client is a pillar of this community," the defense attorney argued. "A man who has given his life to public service and moral leadership. If he took action against Mr. Blackwood's household, it was only because he saw a threat to the very fabric of our society." The testimony that followed was brutal. Witnesses were called to describe the attacks, the fear that had gripped the community, the way innocent people had been terrorized simply for showing kindness to the Blackwood family. But it was Isabella's testimony that proved to be the turning point. The little girl walked to the witness stand with her head held high, her small hand placed on the Bible as she swore to tell the truth. When the prosecutor asked her to describe the night of the barn fire, her voice was clear and steady. "I was playing with the kittens," Isabella said. "I heard the fire start, and I got scared. The smoke was everywhere, and I couldn't breathe. But Papa came for me. He saved me and Whiskers too." "Who is Papa?" the prosecutor asked gently. "Marcus Blackwood. He's my papa now. He married my mama and made us a family. And how do you feel about that?" Isabella's face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire courtroom. "I love having a papa. He reads me stories and teaches me to ride horses and helps me with my letters. He makes mama happy again." The simple honesty of her words seemed to settle over the courtroom like a blessing. Marcus saw several jurors wipe their eyes, and even Judge Harrison's stern expression softened slightly. The defense attorney tried to shake Isabella's testimony, but she answered every question with the same innocent honesty that had already won over the jury. When he asked if she understood that some people didn't approve of her mother's marriage, Isabella tilted her head thoughtfully. "I don't understand why anyone would be angry about love," she said. "Mama says love makes the world better." By the time the closing arguments began, Marcus could feel the mood in the courtroom shifting. The prosecutor's final words were simple but powerful. "The question before you today is not whether you approve of Mr. Blackwood's choices. The question is whether we live in a society governed by law or by the violent whims of men who think their prejudices justify their crimes." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. Calvin Morrison and his associates were found guilty on all charges, sentenced to prison terms that would ensure they could never again threaten the peace of the Montana Territory. As the courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and protests, Marcus felt Catalina's hand slip into his. He looked down at his wife, seeing tears of relief streaming down her face, and knew that their long nightmare was finally over. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple that seemed to promise better days ahead. Marcus lifted Isabella onto his shoulders while Catalina walked beside them, her arm linked through his, her face radiant with hope. "So what happens now?" Dr. Henley asked, joining them as they walked toward the wagon that would take them home. Marcus looked around at the community that had tested them so severely but had ultimately chosen justice over hatred. Some faces were still hostile, but many more were friendly, and he could see acceptance beginning to take root in hearts that had once been closed. "Now we go home," Marcus said simply. "We raise our daughter, we work our land, and we show this community that love really can conquer all." As their wagon rolled through the gates of the Blackwood Ranch, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rebuilt barn. The cattle grazed peacefully in the pastures, and smoke rose from the chimney of the house where his family waited. He had followed a maid after her chores and discovered something that changed everything. Not gold or silver or any material treasure, but the simple, revolutionary truth that a life shared is a life multiplied. He had learned that real wealth isn't measured in dollars or acres, but in the love of family and the strength that comes from standing together against whatever challenges life might bring. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above them, vast and full of stars, and Marcus Blackwood knew that he was finally, truly home.